So with that said, I can now welcome you properly to the event, Feminist City with Leslie Kern. We are absolutely delighted to be able to host this event and have you join us. Some of you will know that this event was previously scheduled for July and was postponed after the sudden death of Engender's much loved executive director, Emma Rich. Emma was passionate about women claiming space and a self-professed planning geek. So we're really pleased to have been able to reschedule this, although her absence will no doubt be felt by lots of us throughout. And thank you to Leslie and Daisy for your flexibility in rescheduling at the last minute. It also wouldn't be right to have an event on public space and feminist planning without mentioning Sabina Nessa, who was killed just over a week ago. When we held an event with Laura Bates back in spring looking at her book Men Who Hate Women, it was the week of the murder of Sarah Everard. And it feels horribly relevant to be talking about how women navigate the world in yet another week when men's violence has been felt so clearly and women are again being faced with public safety advice, which focuses on our actions rather than targeting perpetrators. We can't talk about feminist cities without talking about violence against women and women's safety. So please do take care of yourself over the next hour and just step away from the webinar if you need to. I'm now going to pass the webinar onto the very capable hands of Daisy Narayanan. Daisy is a planning and transport expert who was the director of urbanism at Sustrans before moving to Edinburgh Council to lead their work on mobility and placemaking. Her work brings together ambitions around climate change, the city mobility plan and the 20-minute neighbourhood programme, all issues which, as you know, are of vital importance to anyone with an interest in our public spaces and planning in Edinburgh and beyond. So over to you, Daisy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm so delighted to be here. And, it's a real privilege to be invited to come and have this conversation, Leslie, with yourself, and to really start to unpick a little bit, this wonderful book that you've written. And that was so important to me during the pandemic. Just a quick thought about Emma as well. I remember a conversation with her a couple of years ago where we talked about urban planning, and it was this passionate discussion around urban planning and who are our streets meant for, and power and space and feminist icons. And it's just a moment of reflection on how I think Emma would have enjoyed this evening today, and I hope I hope everyone else who's tuning in does as well. Yeah, Leslie, just as I said, during the pandemic, I found it. Everything was so crazy last year, and all these thoughts around home. I come originally from India. My family's back home in India. Home is here in Edinburgh, and I get to go back home to India once a year, and not being able to do that and see family, and then the Black Lives Matter protest and everything, all together. And I think reading your book at that time, it felt almost visceral to me. It felt like, there were so many themes and aspects in there, especially around safety, especially around home. Who are streets meant for? How do you use it for protest, for safety? It really spoke to me. So again, as I said, it feels like a complete privilege to be here and to speak to you and have this conversation. I'll hand over to yourself just now. I think you're going to read a section or some of your book, and then we can come back and have a discussion. I'll hand it to you now.
Thank you so much, Daisy. And very quickly, thank you to Alice and everyone at Engender for having me for this event. Thank you to the captioner for your work to make this event more accessible. And thank you to everyone in the audience. I can't see you, but I'm really pleased that you're joining us here today. I'm speaking to you today from what is currently known as Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, and is the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people with whom we're governed by ongoing treaties of peace and friendship. So as Daisy said, I've been invited to give a short reading from my book, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. I'm sure my publisher, Verso, would love me to mention that the paperback edition has just been released for US and UK audiences. So please feel free to go to verso.com and check that out, or look for it at your local bookseller. The section that I'm going to read is from the introduction to the book. Women have always been seen as a problem for the modern city. During the Industrial Revolution, cities grew quickly and brought a chaotic mix of social classes and immigrants to the streets. The Victorian social norms of the time included strict boundaries between classes and a firm etiquette designed to protect the purity of high-status white women. This etiquette was fractured by the increased urban contact between women and men, and between women and the city's great seething masses. The gentlemen, and worse still, the gentlewoman, were forced to rub shoulders with the lower orders and be buffeted and pushed with little ceremony or deference, writes cultural historian Elizabeth Wilson. This chaotic transition time meant it was increasingly difficult to discern status, and a lady on the streets was at risk of the ultimate insult, being mistaken for a public woman. This threat to the supposedly natural distinctions of rank and the shakiness of barriers of respectability meant that for many commentators of the time, urban life itself was a threat to civilization. The condition of women, explains Wilson, became the touchstone for judgments on city life. Women's gradually expanding freedoms were thus met with moral panic over everything from sex work to bicycles. The countryside, along with the newly expanding suburbs, would provide a suitable retreat for the middle and upper classes, and most importantly, safety and continued respectability for women. While some women needed to be protected from the city's messy disorder, other women were in need of control, re-education, and perhaps even banishment. Growing attention to city life made the conditions of the working class more visible and increasingly unacceptable to the middle class. Who better to blame than women, who had come to cities to find work in factories and domestic services, thus turning the family upside down, according to Engels. Women's participation in paid labor meant that some small amount of independence and, of course, less time for domestic responsibilities within their own homes. Poor women were cast as domestic failures whose inability to keep clean homes was to blame for the demoralization of the working class. This demoralization expressed itself through vice and other kinds of problematic private and public behaviors. All of this was viewed as a deeply unnatural state of affairs. Of course, the greatest social evil was that of prostitution, which had the potential to destroy the family, shake the foundations of society, and spread disease. In the pre-germ theory understanding of the time, disease was believed to be spread by an airborne miasma carried by noxious sewer odors. The concept, though, of a moral miasma emerged as well. The idea that one could be infected by depravity by sheer proximity to those who carried it. Writers of the time were scandalized by the common presence of streetwalkers who openly plied their trade, tempting good men into a world of vice. Women were also, quote, constantly exposed to temptation, and once fallen, a woman was doomed, many reformers believed, to a life of increasing degradation and an early and tragic death. The last quote from Elizabeth Wilson as well. The solution proposed by many, including Charles Dickens, was for fallen women to emigrate to the colonies, where they might marry one of the many surplus settler men and be restored to respectability. Out here, the need to protect white women settlers from the menace of the, quote, native provided one rationale for the containment and eventual attempt at elimination of Indigenous populations from urbanizing areas. Popular novels of the day depicted sensational stories of kidnap, torture, rape, and forced marriage of white women by marauding, vengeful, quote, savages. These new fortified settler cities would mark the transition from frontier to civilization, and the purity and safety of white women would complete the metamorphosis. On the flip side, Indigenous women were seen as threats to this urban transformation. Their bodies carried the capacity to reproduce the, quote, savagery that colonizers sought to contain, and to mix and therefore pollute the European bloodlines of settler communities. They also held important positions of cultural, political, and economic power in their communities. Stripping Indigenous women of this power by imposing European patriarchal family and governance systems, while simultaneously dehumanizing Indigenous women as primitive and promiscuous, laid the groundwork for the legal and geographic processes of dispossession and displacement. Thus, the degradation and stigmatization of Indigenous women were part of the urbanization process. Given the extraordinary rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls today in settler colonial cities, it's clear that these attitudes and practices have had long-lasting, devastating legacies. Fast forward to today, efforts to control women's bodies to advance certain kinds of city agendas are far from over. In very recent history, we've seen the forced or coerced sterilization of women of color and Indigenous women who receive social assistance or are seen as dependent on the state in some way. the racist stereotype of the Black, quote, welfare queen was circulated as part of the narrative of failing cities in the 1970s and 80s. This has been connected to moral panics over teen pregnancy, with their assumptions that teen moms will join the roles of said welfare queens and produce criminally disposed children. Contemporary movements to abolish sex work have been relabeled as anti-trafficking campaigns, with trafficking cast as a new form of sexualized urban threat. Unfortunately, sex workers who are not trafficked are accorded little respect or agency under this new agenda. Anti-obesity campaigns target women as individuals and mothers, with their bodies and their children's bodies viewed as symptoms of modern urban issues, such as car dependency and fast food. In short, women's bodies are still often seen as the source or sign of urban problems. Even young white women having babies have been villainized as the culprits of gentrification, while proponents of gentrification blame single mothers of color and immigrant women for reproducing urban criminality and slowing down urban, quote, revitalization. There seems to be no end to the ways in which women can be linked to urban social concerns. Thank you. That's the end of my reading for today.
Thank you, Leslie. That's, again, so much in there in terms of, it's about power, isn't it? And it's just, I like the phrase you used, moral miasma, because, you can see now with events happening around us sometimes, issues, similar issues, contemporary issues that echo some of what you've written from the 70s and 80s there. I suppose going right back to the book, what is it that led you to write this book? What was the thinking behind what got you to write this book?
Well, I think I was, first of all, just inspired by the kind of great renewal of public feminist writing from, everyone from Rebecca Solnit, Rebecca Traister, Roxane Gay, and many others who are, I would say kind of revitalizing a public feminist discourse. And I was thinking to myself, what could I contribute to this? And I thought, a geographer's perspective, a spatial perspective, an urban focus to many of the same questions of power and identity and systems and so on that are being, touched on by all of these other writers. And, recognizing that in my day job as an academic and a professor, I get to talk about these issues all of the time with my students and my peers, but I realized that some of the things that I take for granted as a human geographer, like the kind of mutual relationship between society and space, are not that intuitive to most people who maybe haven't looked around them in a way and thought, I wonder how the, design of this particular intersection is shaping the human social relations that are happening around it, right? It's not really an everyday question, yet it is, in the sense that it is about everyday life. So that was kind of my purpose and my intention, was to take some of those ideas and conversations that I have in academic spaces and open them up to a wider audience of people, really, anyone who lives in or visits cities and has ever kind of wondered about some of the social history of those spaces, especially from a feminist perspective.
Yeah, that's, it's really interesting to see how, especially as you said, you look around at your streets and how your neighborhoods are created, how transportation is set up, your networks and the systems are set up, and you just take it for granted. And there isn't often that you ask yourself that question, or people ordinarily ask themselves that question: how does this relate to, what system change needs to occur that our lives get easier, in terms of a junction design or bicycles, as you mentioned. Or it's for me, it's really interesting how your book, you've got the themes, and of course, it's such a good read. It's such an interesting read because you've also brought your personal experiences and, through that, which makes what you're saying real. Was that difficult? Was that, putting, in a sense, it's putting yourself out there and your experiences out there? And how did you come up with those themes and, and saying, I'm going to put my experiences out there?
Yeah, I would say it was difficult. It's sort of an interesting tension because I I come to urban geography from a women's and gender studies background, so feminist background, where, starting from the personal, right? The personal is political and so on, is very much at the core of feminist epistemology, or ways of knowing the world. So it's, always been very important to me to take that seriously. But then, of course, when it comes to putting yourself out there in that way, it certainly has, a different effect, if you will. And it's not that I had never done that before, but most of what you write as an academic reaches a pretty limited audience. And in this case, I knew that, the book would reach at least a somewhat wider audience than what I'm used to as an academic. So, and an audience that might include like my family and my friends and people who know me as well, who are not honestly reading like my peer reviewed journal articles as much as they love me. That's not part of their like recreation time. So yes, it felt a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit vulnerable at times, but I also knew that it was probably a key way that people would find their way kind of into the book. Even if their experiences don't match mine exactly, there's something that they can recognize in it, either from their own life, from the lives of people close to them, or even just, my brother said to me after he read it, he said, oh, now when I'm on the subway, I really notice people with strollers and how little space there is for them and so on. So sharing those day-to-day experiences, I think, has been effective in that way. In terms of the themes that I chose to write about, really, I would say that I just sort of picked things that felt kind of important to me, not necessarily themes that were always the most dominant in feminist urban writing, although I do think there are, certainly overlaps, especially when it comes to questions about fear and so on, which are a common theme in feminist urban literature. But, themes like friendship and protest and motherhood, those were, emerged out of my own experiences. And they, to me, were very much part of how I came to be a feminist geographer, even long before I knew that feminist geography was a thing that existed. But the kind of early trajectory that put me on the path, those elements of my life were kind of contributing to my understanding of the world and of the role of urban places in, shaping our identities and relationships in multiple ways.
Yeah, and one of the themes that resonated with me was the motherhood one, strangely enough, because, I say strangely enough, it's because I have an 8-year-old daughter who is already a staunch feminist, and she makes sure that her brother, who's 11, is very much involved in this feminism of hers. And it was really interesting kind of putting that lens, as a professional who works in this field, and also, having the motherhood lens. It was really interesting and really resonated with me. I wonder if you were to write the book today, are there other themes that you'd have liked to explore, or are there other themes you think that you'd have, or similar themes that you probably would have gone into a bit more depth, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. Early on, when I was talking about the book, even before the pandemic had hit, an interviewer said to me, one of the things that's kind of like, it's present in your book, but you don't focus on it very much, is the home. And I was like, oh yeah, you're right. Like, I talk about it a little bit, but not really in a central way. And then of course, with the pandemic and the, stay home, save lives, all of this kind of thing coming out, and everything from thinking about the implications for domestic violence and, violence against women and children in the home, to questions of childcare and care work in the home, to just even the way that the spatial arrangements of our home have not really been set up to facilitate all of these multiple roles that we're now assuming can happen in the home. The home, I think, started to really loom large as a space that requires a lot more like problematization and critique and intervention. And, sometimes I've given presentations and just called it, blow up the home, save lives, because there's, it encapsulates so many, exploitative kinds of relationships. It hides so much in terms of violence and unpaid labor. We've taken for granted the form, the physical form of the home and the nature of the single family home for so long in many societies that we don't even question whether this is the way that we should or could live. Is this an environmentally sustainable way to live? Probably not going forward. So all of these questions have really been percolating, and I'm grateful that I've had the chance to talk about them with people through events like this. But yes, if I was writing the book again today, I wonder, would I have a chapter that was kind of more devoted to the home as a space? And I think I would, because it's certainly something that I've thought a lot more about. And I don't blame the home for all of our problems in society, but I think we really do have to take a hard look at what we've come to assume is common sense about the home, and think differently about what we might be needing to do going forward to change some of what we've taken for granted.
That's really interesting, actually, the home as a chapter. Yeah. It's, we were talking about this earlier, how, doing some research and looking up, things about the book and the reception that it's had. Was that quite surprising, Leslie? Did you expect the response that you've had? And has there been anything surprising about the response that you've had to the book?
Yes, I mean, I guess on the one hand, it's not surprising that there is like some very negative reaction to, discussions about everything from like, I don't know, skyscrapers as symbols of male power and so on. People really, they'll really, fill your inbox with comments about that if you say things of that nature. But I guess that's not surprising. I was a little surprised to find that architects and like architecture professional organizations and schools of architecture have been interested in hearing me talk, because certainly I'm not an architect and have like almost no expertise in that area at all. But perhaps the most surprising-ish thing about that is how many people, especially students or, recent graduates of architecture, have said to me, oh, I wish I'd had a book like this during my training. I wish we'd had a course about this. I wish we'd learned more about this. And what is and isn't surprising about that is that my book is, I don't want to say there's no new ideas in it, but there's kind of no new ideas in it, in that I'm building on a long tradition of feminist and, women's critiques of cities and design. And I've just put it in a new package, but it's been around for a very long time. And so the fact that it hasn't kind of filtered into professional education in fields like architecture, on the one hand, I say, not surprising, because I think that is kind of a common trend that feminist perspectives on things kind of constantly have to be pushing to be included. But surprising in the sense of like, this shouldn't be new. There's lots of examples to look at of, practitioners, of writing, of, public policy, of all sorts of things that are related to this. But, why are they not in your education yet? And I sometimes feel frustrated by that, but I guess I'm more frustrated on behalf of people who are like, oh, I want to know more about this. I want to do things differently, but I'm not kind of getting it from the standard sources of, my professional education.
That's really interesting you say that, because when I was reading your book, I mean, that was one of the first thoughts that I had. I'm a trained architect, I trained as an architect back home in India, in the University of Bombay. And I remember thinking to myself, I wish I'd had a book that almost in a sense allows you to not just, because as an architect, you are being trained to shape your surroundings and your streets and your spaces and buildings, but then to not be apologetic about being a woman in that man's world, especially back in the 90s was when I was a student. So it's interesting that you're still hearing that now, and as you say, it's a sad indictment perhaps of that, but the good thing is that you are being invited by the profession, and this is now seeping into how things should be, which is brilliant. I can see a couple of questions, so I'm going to I'll take a question from here and then come back to a couple of questions that I have as I was taking notes down. So Ailey's got a question. It says, I have a question about gentrification. I live in a gentrifying area and I feel bad about being part of the problem, but also a woman, I also prefer to walk past the new hipster cafe than the old man pub with men gathered outside. How do we square the circle?
That's a great question. And I feel like what you have just said is literally a paragraph from my next book, which is about gentrification, where I think I literally write almost exactly the same thing about my own experiences of a neighborhood that I lived in Toronto for a long time. That book won't be out until next September, so I won't make you wait until then to answer the question, but thank you for it. I mean, gentrification is kind of the other area of study and research that I do. I agree it's a difficult position to be in, because you can recognize that a lot of the changes that seem to make spaces feel a little safer, more comfortable for women, at least for some women, right? For some women, are possibly changes that are making the environment more expensive or less welcoming, or just feel less like home for other groups of people. So what do you do with that? Are you supposed to kind of sacrifice your comfort and safety for this? Well, you know, there's no easy answer to that, except I do think that we have to be cautious about kind of, you know, jumping on board of, you know, so-called revitalization agendas that tout women's safety as a benefit of changes that are happening to neighborhoods, and keep asking that question, first of all, like, which women, right, are going to be made safer by this? Because chances are there are a lot of women who are not being made safer by that, whether those women are, you know, women of color, low-income women, queer women, trans women, sex workers, homeless women, right? People who have every right to be in that community as well, but who are not likely to be welcome there. So, you know, what can you do on a day-to-day basis? You know, I guess you can think about the choices that you are able to make, you know, not to sacrifice your own safety, but where can you donate money, time, energy? You know, what organizations could you be a part of? What could you do to help, you know, ensure that spaces that serve more vulnerable communities get to remain in the neighborhood as well? You know, not participating in kind of NIMBY or not in my backyard politics, voting for candidates that have, you know, social justice and equality platforms as part of their issues. So I do think it's not kind of all or nothing. There are ways to still try to advocate for a more, you know, diverse, mixed income neighborhood that is, you know, safe for a wide variety of people, not just for those that, you know, the hipster cafe is marketed to.
Yeah, and I suppose following on from that, you know, in the work that I do here, we talk a lot about 20-minute neighborhoods, for example, and so much of this is intertwined with discussions around gender inclusion. I wonder, I mean, one of the questions that keeps getting asked is what happens to, you know, to rural settlements, suburban or rural areas, because it's easier perhaps to have these conversations in an urban setting. And I wonder what your thoughts are, because I suppose in Canada as well, you must have that, you know, like Scotland, large places that are within the rural settlements.
Yes, and certainly for the last 11 or so years, I've lived in a very small town in the province of New Brunswick. So this town is about 5,000 people, plus a small number of university students. So it's a university town, but the surrounding area is extremely rural. So I've had a little bit more firsthand experience of this. And, you know, my thoughts about it are perhaps less about the built environment in terms of kind of a feminist agenda, but more thinking about issues like transportation, or the lack of public transportation, or transportation options that are not a single car option, right? That's a serious issue. The housing and housing affordability, housing options, you know, those are key issues for women. The need for social services like childcare and so on is also key out here. Domestic violence is a huge issue, so we also need those services, and reproductive health services, I think, are also key. So even in places like Canada and the UK, where we have national health services that ostensibly, provide accessible and affordable or free healthcare for majority of people, that also depends on geography, where you live. The province that I live in, abortion is legal in Canada and covered under our health services, and yet there are only there's 3 places in this entire province to get a surgical abortion, and 2 of them are in the same city. Just one is in the French hospital and one is in the English speaking hospital. So given, I'm sure as if any of you have looked at a map, Canada is a pretty big place, and even a smaller province is like geographically, it will take you 5 or 6 hours to drive from one end to the next. So that's the geography of access to those services, and not just for abortion or other reproductive health services, but healthcare in general is really problematic. So I think a rural kind of feminist agenda has to recognize that those barriers are not okay, and they really do contribute to like long-standing inequalities amongst women and amongst other groups in society more generally.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point about geography, isn't it? Because that was the other thing. I suppose I grew up in India, and there's so much of what you say in the book resonates with. But I grew up in a multicultural, melting pot of Bombay, which is very different to if I grew up in a rural village somewhere in the south of India. And I wonder, your book, if it focuses on the global north, because that's, as you've said, is your experience. But I wonder if you have any thoughts around, common themes or what you've seen, across the global south as well. If there are themes that can be picked up and looked at as part of it.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are some common themes. One that I've noticed is that, research on women's experiences of public transportation show a lot of similarities all around the world in terms of the things that women, I don't want to use the word complain, but that women have problems with public transportation. So of course, safety. So women experience a lot of harassment and even, groping and sexual assault on public transportation. Women also find that the way that transportation routes are set up, they don't really serve their caregiving needs and the kind of household errands that they have to do. And they're not really set up for, taking children and babies onto transportation services. The kinds of times of day that women are more likely to use public transportation are the times of day when service is cut. And there's often very little service between residential neighborhoods. So, women who either have caregiving responsibilities or are domestic workers, which is a lot of women around the world, right, do domestic work. They're not traveling to the central business district to do that work. They're traveling to other neighborhoods. But transportation networks are not really designed to do that. They want to take you to the central city and out again as if you are the male breadwinner, right, of 50 years ago, which probably doesn't even reflect most men's lives today in terms of, the very different kinds of work that are out there in the world now. So that, I think, is a common theme kind of around the world. Certainly, I think as well, there is, this persistent, what's the right word, but the persistence of domestic violence as being the greatest threat to women's safety, rather than violence in public, which we don't want to kind of, not pay attention to, right? We don't want to underestimate violence that occurs in public, but around the world, women are, extremely likely to experience some form of violence in the home from family members and known people. And that's an issue that it's not only an urban issue, but I do think it's one that cities can't ignore and push off on, kind of other levels of government as well. So those are a couple of things that I can think of that, I never want to give a universalizing narrative, but I think there's a lot of room for solidarity, put it that way, amongst women all over.
Absolutely, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I've been lucky enough to have grown, lived and worked in many cities across the world. So, London, and lived in the US for a while, and reflecting on transport and how, where transport was easy and accessible and safe and enjoyable is where I seem to have had the best quality of life. And I think that's probably what got me to sustainable transport, and why your book as well kind of spoke to me, especially when you're talking about, public transport and cycling, especially. There's a question here about urban planning and local governance. And how can we ensure that the necessary shifts in urban planning and local governance we need to see in the context of the climate emergency can also ensure that our cities and communities work for women? And again, it's a very topical question for me, working in local government and trying to shape, how the next few years as we emerge from the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I would also be interested to hear, Daisy, your thoughts on this. I think I agree with sort of the premise of the question that we do need to tie these things together, and that we can't kind of rush towards so-called like green initiatives and so on without paying attention to the equity implications, gender equity, but also racial equity, class equity, and age and ability as well, because it's quite easy to leave whole groups of people behind as we sort of rush towards what we hope is a more sustainable or better future. I was just speaking with someone recently, and she was telling a story about a city in Northern Europe where they were very pleased to have like electrified their entire bus fleet. So that's great. It's a great sustainability initiative. You're cutting down on, diesel fuel use and fossil fuels. But she said, their research had shown that if just an equal number of men had started taking the bus as women, they would have had the same fossil fuel savings as electrifying the whole bus fleet, right? So it's just interesting that there's that kind of social dynamic as well, and a question of like, okay, if we don't kind of pay attention to gender equity and gender differences, like how much progress can we actually make, and what solutions are we kind of leaving off the table if we're like, well, we'll just electrify the bus fleet, but we'll just let all these men continue to drive their like single, person like vehicles or private vehicles and so on. So it's just one example that I've heard, but I agree, we really need to pay attention to those things at the same time. I don't think they're competing objectives, but often the people who are working at them are maybe not speaking, they're not in the same rooms always. So we need to sort of get them in the same spaces together.
100%. I think that is so spot on. We need a space, we need a spot at the table, and we need to be making sure that those conversations are happening in a way that we know what question needs answered before jumping in with the solution. What is it that we're trying to achieve collectively? And what are the unintended consequences of jumping into solutions that are being touted as the way forward? So no, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting place we find ourselves in now, isn't it? With the intersection of equality, inclusion, climate justice, just transition. I think the next few years are going to be key in how we shape the world going forward. Do you feel optimistic, Leslie, about having written the book and the ideas that you put forward, that they will happen?
Well, it kind of depends on the day as to how I'm feeling, and maybe what's in the news, what I've read in the morning when I wake up and scroll the news with my cup of coffee. I think on the one hand, I think, especially with the pandemic and the way that it kind of raised or re-raised consciousness about some issues around, say, for example, care work or health inequalities, et cetera, that, you need at least that awareness out there to be able to make some changes. I think that's a good thing. And there might be pressure to really ensure that care work is more collectively provided for. In Canada, I think the pandemic kind of pushed the federal government to finally move towards, they've not implemented it yet, it's going to take many years, but a national childcare system, because of a recognition that like you actually cannot have this thing called the economy, with all of these women forced to leave the workforce because of their, unfair care burden. So in that sense, yes, there's that push to change, but it's also very frustrating that it takes, crisis situations. And so looking ahead, to how far do we have to get into a climate crisis before we rethink some of the ways that we live and, our consumption patterns and how we move through space and all of those kinds of things. So in that sense, it's a little frustrating because there's, we're clearly in the crisis. There's no kind of going back from that, but we're not too late to make some changes, but they are going to be painful, but they're only going to get more painful in the future. So what's the level of pain that we want to accept? Yeah, that's how I feel those days.
I know I keep saying that it's my, it's my little ones who keep me optimistic, because you can see the world through their eyes and you think, actually, yeah, it's so clear-eyed, their vision for the future. And it's kind of harnessing that and keeping that in your mind. That's what works for me. A couple of good questions coming in. There's one from Katie who talks about, says, between Westminster, Holyrood and local government, we have an interesting political system in Scotland. How do we balance national coherence with local autonomy when it comes to feminist town planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in Canada, we also, we have a federal government, but we have provincial governments that are responsible for lots of areas of social policy, including education and healthcare. And then we have municipal governments that are responsible for things like social housing and, all of the kind of infrastructure. So, kind of a similar questions about kind of who's responsible for what. I think, there's a lot of potential in local government, right, for making some of the changes that can impact people's lives on a day-to-day basis, right? Some of the things that feel very material, that feel very concrete. So some things that are as simple as making sure that there is, a safe crosswalk, right, to use to get across the street. That can make a big difference in somebody's life. Things like, improving the frequency and reliability of bus service. That really matters, right? When you need to get to work and you need to get your kids to school and all of those things, right? So I think there's a lot of good reasons why feminists might want to be really involved in local governance and to push local authorities to do some of these things. They do make a material difference, but of course it's probably at the national level that you're going to see those big kind of social policy interventions like national childcare, for example, or, good parental leave policies, pay equity, sometimes even, major investments in housing. Those kinds of things might need to come from higher up levels, universal basic income, all of these like kind of potential policy things are not as easily done at the municipal level, although some cities have passed things like living wage bylaws where all the employers within the city, they need to pay at least, like in the US, for example, a $15 minimum wage, still not quite enough to live on, but better than, $8 an hour, for example.
Thanks. I'm conscious of time. There's a question here about, it says, Liz says, glad you mentioned age. Green Agenda, where I am, is all about getting people onto bikes, no matter how old or time they wish to travel. I've had many discussions about hospital visiting to older people in hospital and care. Also interested in current work around intergenerational spaces and places for forming relationships.
Yes, this is such a great point and something that I've been thinking more about over the last year and a half as well. With to pick up on the point about bicycling, I'm not a cyclist myself. So, that's not, I'm not occasionally like a little eye rolly at all of the sort of, it's all about bikes. It's all about bikes, because even if you do want it to be all about bikes, there's still equity questions to ask. What neighborhoods do the bike lanes go through? What's the traffic situation there? Are they wide enough that you can pull a trailer with children behind you or in front of you? What's the culture around like sexual harassment, because women on bikes get harassed a lot, just like women walking do, right? So there's all of those questions. And then of course, as your question's pointing out, it's like, an assumption about ability and about, age that goes along with this in terms of, who we're expecting to ride these bikes. And you're then, as your question indicates, it opens up broader questions about how we're thinking about aging in cities. Some cities like Singapore, for example, in recognition of an aging population, are trying to move towards like universal design principles to ensure the greatest kind of physical accessibility of the urban environment possible, in recognition that, unless we want 70% of our population to be housebound, like we actually need lifts, we need braille, we need, clear access points, we need buses that, you can step onto without taking a step up, all of those changes. So that's really key. And I think the pandemic has shown too that in a lot of societies, like here in North America, our kind of habit of sort of warehousing the elderly in long-term care homes, kind of out of sight, out of mind, was really devastating in terms of the illness and death from the pandemic. But we don't have a lot of other great options, right? We don't zone well for multi-generational housing. There's a lot of limitations on that, and it's just not part of the sort of the dominant culture. So it's something that I think we really have to think and rethink going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point about cycling. That well, I do cycle, and I have an e-bike, and I absolutely love it. I work in sustainable transport, so perhaps without unintentionally, I'm perhaps quite guilty as well of really, when you talk about transport and the need to shift to modes that are more active. But I think as urban planners and transport planners, we all need to be very careful that the wider discussion around cycling fits into how we view our places, and that inclusion and equity are part of that conversation rather than cycling seen as an end in itself. So completely understand. There's a question around how we can ensure that the necessary shifts in urban planning and local governance. I think, I'm not sure if I've picked this up already, but how we need to see it in the context of the climate emergency and ensure that our cities and communities work for women. I'm not sure if you've picked that up, Leslie, but if, yeah.
I think we did discuss that one, yeah.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, Alice. We've got, I think I need to hand over back to you in a couple of minutes, but before I do that, can I just ask one last question as my prerogative, as having this conversation with you, is, I mentioned my daughter, she's 8, and I talk about her a lot because, she has transformed the way I look at the world. And I wonder what you, whenever she decides to read the book, age 12, 15, or tomorrow, what do you think your message for young people, really young people is? You're a teacher yourself, so it would be good to get a sense from you.
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, maybe one message would be just to like pay attention to the built environment, although not only the built environment, but the spaces around us as a potential site of social activism, social change, and intervention, that there is potential there. I don't think they're the be all and end all. We're not going to solve all social problems through design, but there's a lot there. And, if you have interest in going into fields that don't immediately seem like they have a lot to do with feminism or social justice or whatever, I think you can still bring that social justice and equity perspective to kind of whatever you do, whether it's designing apps, right? Those need equity perspectives in them, or, computer programming, or, more traditional, like nonprofit, community organizing work. All of those things require, equity perspectives. And I think bringing equity to design is, an exciting area, to look ahead to, with lots of potential. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Leslie. And it's, I don't know where the time's gone. I've just been keeping an eye so I can pass over at the right time, but it's been absolutely thoroughly fascinating. And I'm sure we could continue this for a long time, but I'm going to pass over back to Alison. Thank you again for that.
They got me, I was muted. Thank you to Daisy and Leslie, and apologies that my face appeared halfway through that. My computer had felt a little bit Monday evening, as I'm sure we all do. So thank you so much for that discussion. I think just on what you're saying there at the end there, Leslie, that we need to bring feminism into everything we do. It's not those feminist fields, and I was feeling that throughout, as we looking at this as an issue of public space, an issue of planning, but we've talked there about abortion, about unpaid care, about ageism, about employability, about climate, about all of these different things. So we really need to see it in the round. I'm finishing off with a question for Leslie and for Daisy, and that's Daisy's been an excellent chair, and one of the great things about being chair is you get to ask the questions, but you often don't get to answer them. So I'm sneaking in with a question for both Daisy and Leslie. I'm sorry, quite a cliched, boring question, but I'm just really interested to know your answer. So if you could, both of you, wave a magic wand and implement one change in how our public space works for women, however you define or see public space, what would it be? People normally cheat and give me a list of 7 things. I would like one thing that you're doing with your magic wish. You can't wish for more wishes. Daisy, you kick us off first.
Do you want me to go first? I'm going to go back to the point about cycling, because I found that really interesting. And I think if I had a magic wand, I'd like to wave it around and have in this wonderful city I call home, Edinburgh, and across Scotland, have a fully connected, coherent, safe, direct, attractive network of space that people feel safe and that it's pleasurable to cycle in, just because it then allows and frees up space for others who need to drive, or who need to use the roads, and picking up the point that was asked in the question. So it becomes easier for everyone, but I think the issue with the built environment as it is now, and some of the conversations around the change that needs to happen, is that it is fragmented and it's not part of the whole, the discussions that we've had today. So yes, a fully connected, coherent cycle network that allows us to then have space for people on foot and those who need to drive, and public transport. So there you go. I've given a very transport-focused response, but I think it's because that question really, really stuck in my head.
Thank you, and very on brand, Daisy. I think there'd have been disappointment if you didn't plug cycling in your magic wish. Leslie, how about you?
Well, I was also going to give a transportation related answer. It was obviously very hard to choose, as you suggested with the question, like what would that magic wand be? But I totally agree with Daisy's point. I mean, maybe I would, use my magic wand powers to actually, put it even more bluntly, which it would be to like get rid of cars almost entirely from urban public spaces, or severely limit where cars can go, because I agree. I mean, that opens up other modes of transportation, but it also opens up public space for all sorts of other activities. And part of what I've been talking a lot about during the pandemic is, can we collectivize care? Can we bring care work into public space? But we need space to do it. And you can't do that in a totally car-dominated environment. So, getting rid of the cars would be the first thing. And then we could see what that would allow us to bring into public space.
Excellent. I'm all for that, and I love transport chat, so I'm happy you both went with transit related answers for that one. So that's us. Thank you all so much to everyone who's come, and thank you to Leslie and Daisy for taking part. As I said at the start, this has been recorded, so it will be available on the Engender website, and we'll also email everyone that signed up to let you know when that's live. And of course, we're after a short break. We're going to be recording an episode on the Engender, Scotland's feminist policy podcast, so do check that out as well. Make sure you're subscribed and you will be told when the episode comes out. This has been a really enlightening hour. I will leave with a final plug for Leslie's book, now available in paperback. You should be following both Leslie and Daisy on Twitter. They're both excellent. Find out more about Daisy's work in Edinburgh Council and the work she's doing. Find out more about Leslie's new book when it's coming out and all the other things she's getting involved in. If you're not a member of Engender, I'd encourage you to join engender.scot/join, where you can find out about all of the different policy work we do on public space and everything else besides. Lots of folk in the chat saying they're off to buy the book, so that's very lovely. And have lovely rest of evenings, everyone. I was going to say safe home, which is how we normally sign off, but most of you are probably already home, so safe moving from this chair to a different chair.
Thank you. Thank you.